Last week, we introduced you to the Calvinist doctrine of unconditional election, according to which God chooses from eternity past who it is that will be saved and who will not. And we asked whether or not in that doctrine, unconditional election is arbitrary. But we didn't discuss whether or not it's true. That's what we'll be discussing today. Is unconditional election biblical? This is Chris Date, and welcome to Theopologetics, where every other week I discuss a wide variety of theological issues and show how a properly biblical worldview can help defend the historic Christian faith from its critics. Join me as we think through what we believe and why we believe it, and not something else. Sorry for stumbling over my words so much. I'm trying to do this simulation of the way I see a lot of YouTube shows start, where there's a very short, intro saying what the episode's going to be about, and then there's the opening music and video, and then we get into the content proper. And I'm trying to make that transition at the beginning smooth. Hopefully starting next week it'll be a little bit smoother. I was a little... stumbling over my words for one reason or another. For those of you who, for one reason or another, are here for the first time, thank you so much for tuning into Theopologetics. Theopologetics is a combination of the words theology, the first four letters of it, and the word apologetics, all but the first letter of it. Theopologetics slammed together, and we talk about a variety of things related to theology and apologetics. This used to be an audio-only podcast a number of years ago, but after several years of a break, we are resurrecting the show as a live YouTube show every other week, alternating Mondays at 6 p.m. Pacific. So that's where you are today, and as I mentioned in the introduction, today we'll be discussing the Calvinistic doctrine of unconditional election. And I'm going to have a guest on. I've already pre-recorded this interview because he couldn't, his schedule is such that he couldn't do it live. But he's got some notes that he has made available for you watching. If you want to be able to follow along with his thought processes, some of the issues of grammar that we'll be discussing, and there'll be a lot more there than we'll cover in this interview. So if you are interested in those notes, I included a link to them in the description of this YouTube video, and if somebody could let me know in the chat if they have any problems accessing that document, I'd appreciate it. Maybe I can fix it here very soon. So again, if you want to follow along, click on that link that's in the description of the video, and that will allow you to dig more deeply. While you're testing that out, I've got a few sort of announcement type stuff to make. First of all, and this is really exciting for gamer nerds like me, tomorrow pre-orders become available for the Xbox Series X. For those of you who may not be aware, the most recent generation of gaming consoles was the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4, if I'm not mistaken, and it's been several years since that generation of consoles was made available. And this holiday season, both PlayStation and Microsoft are coming out with their next generation consoles. PlayStation, of course, Sony, of course, the PlayStation 5, and Microsoft, the Xbox Series X. Pre-orders they go on sale tomorrow, and depending upon where you are in the world, the time at which pre-orders become available will be different. So the only one I know is that in the U.S. It's tomorrow starting at 8 a.m. Pacific time, my time. You East Coasters, that I guess would be 11 a.m. So if you're a gamer nerd like me and are interested in getting the next generation console from Microsoft, make sure you pre-order tomorrow. And there's also a slimmer, digital-only version of this same series called the Xbox Series S. But the downside of that is that it doesn't have as beefy of hardware and stuff like that. So my recommendation is that you would get the Xbox Series X, but it is a bit of a price tag. It's, I think, $500 as compared to the $300, I think, for the Xbox Series S. But anyway, so I just wanted to mention that in case any of you like me are gamer nerds. I've been playing a really interesting game series on my Xbox One lately called Life is Strange, and I just discovered last night that after the first series of 5 episodes of that game, there's also a prequel of 3 episodes, and then there's a sequel to the original after that, and I'm just loving the franchise, so I'd encourage you to check that out, and I'm looking forward to seeing if that game company does anything with the next generation console. Next quick announcement is that several weeks ago, a couple of months ago, it looks like it was July 31st, time flies, I was on my friend Isaiah Burridge's podcast called Depends on How You Look at It. You can find it at buzzsprout.com/1211588, but it's probably just easier to do maybe it's easier to do a Google search for Depends on How You Look at It podcast, but I'm not 100% certain that it is easily found in search results. But anyway, I was on that show a couple of months ago in July to discuss the whether or not human beings have immaterial souls, and if that's something you're interested in, you can check that out. Tomorrow, I will be joining Isaiah to record the next episode of his podcast on Matthew 24, the sermon on the Olivet Discourse, the eschatological prophecy sermon that Jesus delivered on the Mount of Olives, and the famous verse is Matthew 24:34. This generation shall not pass before all these things take place. And many, maybe even most, at least American Christians, think that Jesus is talking about either some future generation or a race of people or a kind of people. But I'll be joining Isaiah to talk about the perspective that I hold and that he holds, known as preterism, not full preterism, which is a terrible way to put it, not hyper-preterism, that's the better way to put it, but rather orthodox preterism, historic preterism, what really ought to be just called preterism full stop, which is the view that most biblical end times prophecies, but not all of them, were fulfilled in the past, particularly in and around the destruction of the Jerusalem temple by the Roman armies in 70 AD. So if you're not familiar with that view, if you assume that this generation shall not pass before all these things take place as a reference to some future generation or a race or kind of people, and you'd like to be challenged on that perspective, then be on the lookout for the next episode of Depends on How You Look at It podcast, hosted by Isaiah Burridge, in which I will, together with him, challenge that very typical American Christian perspective. Next, I last week did a debate on the Trinity Radio YouTube channel. Trinity Radio is the YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/Braxton Hunter. Braxton Hunter is the president of the college and seminary at which I am an adjunct professor, Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary. And Trinity Radio is the YouTube show, the official YouTube show for that seminary. And again, you can go to youtube.com/Braxton Hunter to go to their channel. But if you go to videos, you'll see that right here at the top, third from most recent, I debated the relationship between Israel and the church with fellow adjunct professor Steve Gregg, and Braxton moderated. I think the debate went very well. Steve did a good job challenging my perspective, which is that there is no sense in which the church is Israel or the Israel is the church, but the church and Israel are distinct but overlapping entities. He challenged me pretty well, I think, but I also think that I challenged his perspective well, and I didn't find his case compelling. So if you want to check that debate out, then go to the Trinity Radio YouTube channel and give that a watch, and I'd love to hear from you, in terms of how you think we both did. Speaking of Braxton Hunter was recently added to the lineup of plenary speakers at this year's Rethinking Hell conference. This will be in early November 6th and 7th, if you can see it highlighted on the screen here. November 6th and 7th is just coming up in less than a couple of months in Federal Way, Washington, which is sort of a suburb of Seattle. And we have confirmed with the venue that the conference is still on and in person. We just have a limited availability. We have a limited number of seats that we can fill. So if you haven't yet registered and you think you can be in the Seattle area on November 6th and 7th, I would encourage you to go to rethinkinghellconference.com. And even if you can't be in the Seattle area, go to that website, because there is an online live streaming registration option for 10% of the normal ticket. And you'll get to see excellent presentations by each of our plenary speakers, including Paul Copan. That was a coup getting him. Dr. Braxton Hunter as well, the person I just mentioned a moment ago. Clay Jones, formerly of Biola University, before they started requiring dispensational premillennialism, or at least premillennialism, on the part of their staff. Tim Barnett from Stand to Reason. There is a chance he won't be able to make it in person, because as of last time I spoke with him, Canada, which is where he lives, had a travel ban. So he may be delivering remotely, not 100% sure yet, and that's why we added Braxton Hunter. So there will be 4 plenary speakers, if not Tim, then, or at least 4, possibly 5, and then of course I'm least and last. So It's going to be a great conference. We're going to be talking about the relationship between apologetics and hell. And in case you don't know, I'm the only one of these 5 speakers that does not hold to the traditional view of hell as eternal torment. So don't think that if you come here, all you're going to be doing is hearing people argue in support of a view of hell that you don't hold or something like that. No, you're going to be hearing from only one person that holds to something other than the traditional hell. But we all consider each other brothers, and we'll be talking about how we as Christians together, whatever view of hold we have, whatever view of hell we happen to hold, how it is that we can address this apologetic problem of hell. So, rethinkinghellconference.com. I'd love to see you there, or have you see us from afar via a live online streaming option. Finally, speaking of Rethinking Hell, this coming Friday, so just 4 days away, at 4 a.m. Pacific time on September 25th, the reason it's 4 a.m. is because of what I'm about to say, I'll be delivering a lecture on the topic of hell remotely for the South African Theological Seminary, sats.edu.za. I'm going to be discussing the traditional view of hell versus my view of hell, conditional immortality or annihilationism. My understanding is that this is free to register, even if you're not a student at SATS. So if you go to sats.edu.za/live-events/rethinking-hell, or you might even be able to just do a Google search for South African Theological Seminary, Chris Date. And actually, you know what? Instead of Chris Date, do Rethinking Hell. That'll probably get you there. Actually, now I'm having a problem finding it. All right, well, in any event, sats.edu.za/live-events/rethinking-hell. You can register online, and it'll be available at some point in their YouTube channel after the lecture. So, yeah, hope you'll check that out. And again, I'd love to hear from you. If you have some thoughts on it after you've watched it, I'd love to know what those are. All right, so with those announcements out of the way, I've been a friend for a few years now with a fellow Calvinist, but somebody who holds to a different view than I do on Israel and the nature of hell. His name is Robert Wiesner. He's a graduate of Dallas Theological Seminary. He is working on starting a PhD at some point in the not-too-distant future, and he is a co-author of sorts of a series of articles that's coming out in the journal that goes with the Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary, called the Journal of the Ecclesia Scholar Society, or Ecclesia Scholar Society. I'll have to ask how they pronounce that. But that's a journal. And in an upcoming issue of their journal, Robert and I and a few others are authors of a series of articles on the nature of hell. I'm not sure if I asked him about it in this interview you're about to watch, so I'll just tell you now. It's a series of articles that present, each of which presents a case for one of the 3 major views of hell from the Book of Revelation specifically. I've got an article that will introduce the 3 articles and sort of laying out the 3 views from a high view and from a high level, and what it is that each of us agrees on. And then me and a co-author and I, William Tanksley and I, will be writing or we'll have an article in this series defending conditional immortality or annihilationism from Revelation. A universalist scholar will be presenting a case for universalism from the Book of Revelation, and Robert, my guest today, will be making a case for the doctrine of eternal torment from the Book of Revelation. So be on the lookout for that. He's a fantastic scholar, except on the topic of hell. But on something although we don't agree on the nature of hell, however, we are both Calvinists, and we also in certain ways have certain views related to Calvinism that aren't identical to what all other Calvinists happen to believe. So this might be a little bit interesting. You might discover some things that maybe you hadn't heard Calvinists affirm and deny before. But in any event, what we're going to be discussing in this episode that you're about to watch, this interview that you're about to watch, we're going to be looking at Romans 9, Romans chapter 9. We're going to be going through it with a certain degree of, with a fine-tooth comb, in some detail, looking at the Greek, and asking the question: does Romans 9, or rather, I should say, to what extent does Romans 9 support the Calvinist doctrine of unconditional election? As I said, this interview you're about to watch is pre-recorded, but I'm going to try to hang around in the chat and answer questions here and there. I won't always be here at the screen, but hopefully I will be if you have questions. So feel free to interact and chat in the YouTube chat, and I will be back after this interview is over to bid you farewell. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in. Here we go. All right, Robert. Why don't you start by telling me and my viewers, well, you don't need to tell me this, I already know about you, but why don't you tell viewers about yourself, who you are, what your interest is in this topic, stuff like that.
Sure. So I'm a pastor, Kenmore Baptist Church here in Kenmore, New York. I've been here for a couple years. That's what I do vocationally, but I'm also very much a Bible nerd. Try to envision my vocation as that pastor theologian role. So eventually I plan to get around to doing a PhD in New Testament. I went to Dallas Theological Seminary, where I wrote my master's thesis on the Jewish background to Paul's predestinarian language, and part of that thesis was published recently in the Westminster Theological Journal. So readers who are interested in that, or listeners, I should say, could go back and check that out. But it's continued to be an interest of mine since I first was exposed to these texts, especially Romans 9, that seems so strongly to emphasize the majesty and freedom of God, and our election, his choice of us. And I've grown and become hopefully more nuanced and more biblical in my understanding of what's going on in Romans 9. It's a difficult text, and I don't think either side should try to say otherwise. We wouldn't be doing justice to it if we did. There are lots of problems and questions in the text, but I do think its big picture message is pretty clear. And as we'll talk about today, when we hone in on some of the grammar and the discourse features of the text, we can get focused in on what was primary for Paul and his thought. And I think it's a step, towards building a case for the idea of unconditional election.
Okay. What is, you used the language of first encountering a minute ago when you described first encountering the strong predestinarian language here in Romans 9. That suggests to me that there was, and I could be wrong about this, I don't know your background, but is that an indication that at some point in your Christian faith you weren't a Calvinist and then you became one? And if that's the case, can you tell us about what that process was like?
Yeah, definitely. So I went into the Marine Corps right out of high school, and I was stationed in Southern California. And while I was there, I got plugged into the Calvary chapels, which I don't know if you're familiar with them, but that's where I really fell in love with the Bible. And say what you want, week in and week out, every time we gathered, we had our Bibles open and we were talking about the Bible, and it was what I felt like I was meant for. I just loved learning and everything, and really dug in deeper than most in that movement. They're kind of suspicious of the critical exegetical stuff, and that was where my mind wanted to go. And the first time I ever heard the term Calvinist was in a discipleship class there at the church that I attended, where we watched a video of Norm Geisler's, I think it's like 5 Reasons I'm Not a 5-Point Calvinist, or something like that. Some somewhat famous sermon that he gave about what's wrong with Calvinism. And a friend of mine who's actually my brother-in-law now, we kind of went into this journey with sleepless nights, like trying to figure out, how do you reconcile what's going on in Romans 9 with John 3:16, and can there be limited atonement with 1 John 2:2, and what's going on with all this stuff. And so eventually it just kind of clicked into place for me, and what really seemed to me to be a very clear and compelling way of fitting all the pieces together. Now I would say that I'm wary more now of the way that Calvinism has tended to be overly systematic, leading to a little bit of anachronism sometimes. And so some Calvinists would probably not like my variety of it. I've been trying to come up with a different label. building on the trends of plant-based meats and working with the label impossible Calvinism, right? So without any meats, without the systematics, and completely plant-based, completely Bible-based, and so there are a few nuances that I would imagine you and I might see a little bit different. But as much as I can, really trying to let the biblical language speak and be very, very precise with it, and not make it say more than it intends to say. Doing good exegesis, looking at the occasion of what was going on in Romans 9 or what was going on in Ephesians chapter 1, and trying to situate that, especially in the context of Second Temple Jewish theology, and that was the atmosphere where the first Christians had to explain God's election in light of the fact that now there are all these Gentiles joined to the people of God, being blessed in the Messiah, and all of that. So that's a little bit of my journey with that. Trying to keep the label because it's helpful. It lets people know generally where I am, but also trying to distance myself, I think, from some of the over systematization that can be a tendency there. Yeah. I'm sure you appreciate that.
Yeah, no, that's good. It's interesting that you say that a very I almost use the word rabid, but a very adamant non-Calvinist. It's through the work of a very adamant non-Calvinist, namely Norm Geisler, that you began to be attracted to Calvinism. It's funny because I hear that often. James White, for example, on Alpha and Omega Ministries, he often points out that many people have come to Calvinism because they hear really bad arguments against it, and I think that's interesting. But one person who seems to, at least it seems on the surface at least, that he is changing a lot of minds and causing waves from the other direction is my friend Leighton Flowers, a fellow professor at Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary. He's got a show, as you know, called Soteriology 101, and he recently had you on his show as a guest to discuss Romans 9. Tell us about the background of that, how it happened, how it came about, and what you guys discussed when you discussed Romans 9 on a show.
Yes. So a mutual friend, David Palman, he got us connected, and I was looking for somebody to have a good conversation with about it, just in a Facebook group. Romans 9 comes up quite often, and sometimes you know how social media goes. The conversations aren't always all that great and beneficial, and so I thought, maybe there's a venue to do this in a more productive way, where people can be a little more disarmed and listen a little better. And so he asked if I'd be willing to discuss it with Leighton, and I thought it went really well. We had kind of short notice. My third child was just born a couple days after that, so we were up against the clock, wondering if we were even going to be able to get the recording done before my wife went into labor, and we did. And I thought it went well, but there are pros and cons to not being able to prepare. What was nice about it was I don't think either of us really had our guards up. I think we were able to have a really good conversation, enjoyed talking to each other and digging into the text and pressing each other a little bit, but not in a combative way. And but what that meant was we weren't on script. So there were a number of things where it was I wish I had said this, or I should have nuanced that, or maybe I didn't answer that question very well. And so as I read back through it and did something that you should never do, read a couple of YouTube comments, I thought, there is probably some opportunity to do something as a follow-up on that, and I'd love to chat with Leighton about it some more in the future on his show. But one of the things that somebody said is, why don't you guys just walk through the Greek? And I don't know what Leighton's utility with Greek is, but Greek is my thing. I went to Dallas Theological Seminary, where if you learn anything from that place, you learn how to work with Greek grammar. I think in the course of my studies there, I had to read Wallace's big old thick Greek grammar 3 times cover to cover. So I love working in Greek, and I thought, is there a way I could present what's going on with Paul's argument there in an understandable way for people who don't read Greek, but which will help them to see what's kind of emphatic and so that we can focus in on what Paul's point is. And I think in Romans 9 we get distracted from that, and because there are other issues. There's of course the theological questions that are debated about predestination and the nature of election and all that, but maybe by focusing in on Paul's discourse and his argument as it progresses, and one of the things that studying the biblical languages does is makes you slow down and say, why did he do that when he could have said this? And we'll see that a couple of places. And when you slow down in that way, and you're not looking at your English text, which we're blessed to have a lot of great English texts. I love them. I use them all the time as a pastor. I never preach from my Greek. I preach from an English translation. But when you do just look at the original language, you can slow down and see some things that maybe you weren't noticing before, and occasionally find some places to correct the text and hopefully hone in on what was central for Paul and understanding what his argument was in Romans chapter 9.
Gotcha. Very good. Well, you used a phrase when I was introducing you a few minutes ago. You used the phrase unconditional election, and that's a topic that I discussed in the last episode of Theopologetics, but not at great length or in any depth. And today we're going to be discussing to what extent we think Romans 9 supports the doctrine of unconditional election. But before we do, can you summarize for us how it is that you understand the phrase unconditional election in the context of Calvinism's tulip?
Sure.
What is unconditional election?
Yeah. So if you're keeping up with the latest New Testament scholarship, specifically, I'm thinking of John Barclay's landmark book, Paul and the Gift, which everybody who hasn't read that, who's interested in Paul's theology, needs to stop what they're doing, lock themselves in a room with that book and read it, and don't come out until you're done. But he prefers, instead of the language of unconditional, unconditioned, because the nature of grace was such in the ancient world that it began a relationship that was mutual. There was reciprocity. There was give and take. We think of a gift, or we think of grace, and if it's a really good gift, or if God is really gracious, he doesn't require any strings attached or ask for anything in return. But that doesn't seem to be quite the picture. So when we talk about election or unconditioned election, it means that human beings didn't do anything, believe anything, say anything, whatever might be the case, that caused God to choose them. Right. So there's not a prior condition that makes one elect. God's election is free. It's his sovereign choice. He did it. We talked a little bit about it before the foundation of the world, as Paul says in Ephesians 1:4. And I think seeing it as unconditioned, as I just expressed, is important when we look in Romans chapter 9, because that seems to be what Paul is emphasizing, that it wasn't with regard to works, it wasn't with regard to worth on the part of the human, and whatever cultural standards of worth might have been in place in Paul's day or for his audience. And he even says it wasn't with regard to human will. So it wasn't an act of the will that caused God to choose. It was God choosing that caused God to choose. And so I think that's what I would want to highlight when we talk about unconditional election.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you finished that up in the way that you did, because one of the things I pointed out in last episode is that some definitions of unconditional election I think are insufficient. In that last episode, I quoted from Wayne Grudem's systematic theology. Not that Wayne Grudem is the end all be all of Calvinism, but he was the theologian on whom I cut my teeth as a young theologian, and I still respect his work. But in it, he defines unconditional election as being that God chooses not based on any merit in the person that he's choosing. But I think you and I would say, and you did just say, it's not just that there's nothing meritorious in the people that he chooses that prompts God to choose them. But it's nothing at all, nothing that they would do or believe or anything like that. And I think that's really important. But let me ask you this. In that episode, last episode of Theopologetics, the whole point of my episode was to push back on on something that Leighton Flowers has been doing for some time, which is insisting that it is appropriate to use the word arbitrary to describe this unconditional election that you and I have been talking about. And viewers will by this point likely have seen that episode and know how I push back on that challenge. But let me ask you the question. If God has chosen who will be saved and who will not based on anything that they would do or be or believe or anything at all, and just purely on his own, by his own sovereign will, then how would you defend how would you defend unconditional election from the charge that that makes God's choice arbitrary? Do you have any thoughts on that before we move on?
Yeah, so there's a number of ways you might come at it. One would be to say, well, what God is doing is, and we'll get into this when we get to verses 22 and 23 of Romans 9. The nature of both election and reprobation are not precisely parallel. There's a little bit of incongruity there that we can notice in the grammar, and I'll want to highlight that when we get there. But so what God is doing is he's extending, what's emphatic is God is extending to mercy to people who do not deserve it, and nobody is going to be judged who did not deserve it, right? So if you want to call that arbitrary, that's God being unconditionally gracious to people who don't deserve it. I don't think that's the right word, right? And beyond that, I would say, well, it was arbitrary for God to create the world the way that it was created, and unless we're open theists and we think that God is being surprised all the time by the direction things go, God arbitrarily set things up so that it would certainly happen the way things have happened. So if you're an Arminian and you believe that God knows the future based on divine foreknowledge, and you say, well, yeah, but still God knew it was going to happen as a consequence of him creating the way that he created. If you're more Calvinistic, you say, well, God set it up. He wrote the script. He wrote the book. He designed it this way. He's the author. And so I just think that categorically arbitrariness is completely the wrong word, both in terms of the nature of the way the Bible presents God's grace and God's election, and in terms of the picture of God as creator. So I'd be interested. I haven't had a chance to listen to your comments on that, but I'd be interested to see, maybe there's more philosophical and linguistic reasons for rejecting it, but to me that just doesn't even get off the ground. I think that's the wrong question, and so yeah.
So I think the issue is that when non-Calvinists critique election in Calvinism as if it's arbitrary, they're picturing it from the position or from the standpoint of God choosing from competing existing options. He creates humankind, and then he picks from all of those humans that he intends to create which of them he will save and which of them he will not. That's the perspective from which non-Calvinists see the choice happening. But as you rightly identified by pointing out that we're looking at this from the perspective of God as creator, the point I make is that when a potter forms a pot, or when a blacksmith forges a sword, or when a puzzle maker designs a puzzle, the person, this crafter, this creator of the thing, isn't choosing from competing existing options. The example I gave in my episode was that episode from Indiana Jones 3. Have you seen Indiana Jones 3, the Last Crusade, the one with Sean Connery?
Yes.
So you know that scene at the end in the chamber where they're picking which cup they think is the Holy Grail? Mm-hmm. So that's the kind of choice that non-Calvinists think of when they hear us talk about election. There's a bunch of options before God, albeit logically, because he made this choice in eternity past. But nevertheless, these competing options will exist, and then from those existing options, God chooses which ones will be saved and which will not. But that's the wrong way to look at it. It's more like a potter crafting a pot. The choice, the election for the pot to be what it is, precedes its existence logically, and that's the nature of that's what it is to be a creator of something. You're not choosing from competing existing options. What it is what it is because you made it what it is. And so I think you were right to I think you hit the nail on the head there. But of course, I would encourage people to, including yourself, to go back and watch and let me know what they think.
I'll check it out.
Before we dive into the text, I have one last question for you, which is, I want to be careful that we don't say more that we don't extrapolate more from Romans 9 than should be. I think many of us Calvinists see Romans 9 as support for the doctrine of unconditional election in sort of a full-fledged, full-throated way, and I wonder if perhaps we sometimes try to make the text say more than it actually does. So before we dive into the text, can you summarize for us what you think it doesn't say, but perhaps some Calvinists try to make it say, versus what it actually does say insofar as it supports unconditional election?
Yeah, so probably the best full-length exegesis of Romans 9 is still John Piper's monograph, The Justification of God, which if you're reading scholarly commentaries and journal articles, you're going to come across that in the footnotes. It's still a standard. We think of Piper as an influential pastor, but he was a very good New Testament scholar before he left the academy to become a pastor. And this book is one that is still widely used. Again, check the footnotes of your favorite exegetical commentaries. You're going to find it there on his treatment of Romans 9. But in that, he makes the point when he's talking about the nature of election, specifically with the reference to Esau and Jacob, where Paul explicitly says that it happened before they were born and had done anything good or evil. And he made this point that the first time I read it, I stopped because I was being a little too systematic. I said, wait a second. But he said that the text doesn't say anything about this being pretemporal, right? Like before the creation of the world, which is what you get elsewhere, Ephesians 1, Revelation 13:8, and some other texts. But it just says it was before they were born. And he says, if some theologian wanted to come up with some scenario that says election just happens before someone is born, fine. What's emphatic here is that it was before they could have done anything, and it was without regard to anything that they did do, etc. So I think if we try to force Romans 9 to say everything that we want to say or believe that the Bible says, then we're not doing it justice. It's got a unique contribution. It especially emphasizes the unconditional side of unconditional election. It doesn't especially emphasize the prior to creation-ness of unconditional election, but it tells us that God's choice was not conditioned by anything human beings did. God chooses as he wills to extend mercy to those he wills, and he hardens those whom he wills as well. And also I would say we need a focus, because Paul is answering the question of Israel's unbelief in his day, which is sort of a problem that his gospel as he presented it from Romans 1:18 up until chapter 9 is sort of left unanswered. Well, what's going on? Why is it the case that so many Israelites are not embracing Jesus as the Messiah? Wasn't the promise for them? And so we need to keep it in that context, keep it Israel specific in the right way. We can extrapolate principles from it, but we want to do full justice to it there and recognize, it doesn't address the extent of the atonement. It does touch on the nature of the effectual call. That's an important term, but not in a full-fledged way that we might want. It doesn't talk about perseverance, for that matter. So we don't want to make it say more than it says. It's a step in an argument, and it's an important step in that, because again, the unconditioned nature of election is what's emphatic here, and I think pretty unavoidable.
Okay, well, let's start digging in and begin by just sort of telling us where you think Romans 9 comes in Paul's larger argument that he's been making in Romans. I mean, don't go into too much detail and spend too much time, but just, you mentioned, for example, the focus on Israel in this chapter, and there are some treatments of Romans that treat Romans 9 to 11 as if it's sort of in a parenthetical, afterthought kind of thing. But it seems to me that Paul sees a really important reason for addressing the question that he does here. So situate Romans 9 for us in Paul's larger argument before we start digging into the text.
So in the book of Romans, Paul has talked about his gospel, that it's a gospel that placed a call on his life to bring about the obedience of faith among the Gentiles or the nations, but it is still a gospel that is for the Jew first and also for the Greek. Romans chapter 1 verses 16 16 and 17 that it's the power of God for salvation for everyone who believes, but there's a priority for God's fulfillment, God's faithfulness to Israel, and that question gets raised a number of times throughout. If Israel is unfaithful, will God's faithfulness be nullified or called into question or anything like that? And well, it looks like God's faithfulness has been nullified and called into question, precisely because, elephant in the room, the majority of ethnic Israelites, Jewish people, the descendants of Abraham, are not currently embracing this gospel, are not experiencing God's power for salvation in Christ. They are not believing. What gives account for that issue? Does that invalidate Paul's gospel, or does Paul see God at work doing something else through Israel's unbelief, accomplishing some greater ends in this situation? And I think Romans 9 is 9 through 11 is Paul's answer to that. So Romans 8 concludes with this language of God's call, that we are his people who are foreknown, predestined, called, justified, and glorified, and nothing can separate us from the love of God. And then he brings up the issue of God's word, God's promise throughout Romans 9. Is that reliable? Is it trustworthy, since the Israelites are not embracing it or not benefiting from it? And Paul gives an emphatic yes. It's a complex argument, but part of that complex argument is to appeal in chapter 9 to God's freedom to extend mercy and to harden as he determines.
Okay. Now, we are going to go into detail into the text beginning in verse 6, but in the first 5 verses of Romans 9, I do want to ask you a question about Paul's statement about his fellow Jews, because as you are probably aware, many non-Calvinists, including Leighton Flowers, has made the argument that here in verse 3, which I think I've got up on the screen for viewers, when Paul says he could wish that he were accursed, damned, cut off from Christ for the sake of his brothers, non-Calvinists like Leighton Flowers will sometimes argue that if Calvinism is true, this is an indication that Paul is actually more merciful, more compassionate, more loving toward the Jews than even God himself. How would you respond to that charge before we continue through Romans 9?
Yeah, so the background to a lot of what's going on in Romans 9 biblically is Exodus 32 through 34, where Israel has just committed the famous golden calf idolatry, and Yahweh and Moses have this conversation where Yahweh says, look, I'm done with this people. They're stiff-necked. I'm going to destroy them and start over with just you. I'm gonna make my promise actualized through you. And Moses intercedes for Israel, and he begs and pleads, and ultimately he wins Yahweh over. And that's where you get the revelation of God's mercy there. And again, it's a text that Paul appeals to multiple times. And Paul is kind of standing in that place of Moses here as he writes that. He cares for them. His heart's desire, he says in chapter 10, verse 1, is for their salvation. And yet he recognizes God's freedom based on that same text to have mercy as he sees fit. And so part of the solution as well is to look forward to the end in chapter 11. Ultimately, Paul's desire and God's desire, even on a Calvinist reading, are identical. Paul wants all Israel saved. God is going to save all Israel, but it's going to take the reversal of their hardening, which God is using as a means to bring the gospel to the nations and to bring in this group that he calls the fullness of the Gentiles, the fullness of the nations. And but then ultimately all Israel will be saved. Now, what does that mean along the way? We're going to see that it does involve preparing vessels of wrath for destruction, and I think that means that some Israelites, according to God's design in this grand scheme of saving this group he calls all Israel, involves the eternal judgment and condemnation of these people who are called vessels of wrath prepared for destruction. But I don't think there's a whole lot to that argument. I see it as kind of an emotional, rhetorical appeal. Oh, well, look, Paul is nicer than God if Calvinism is true. But I don't think there's too much substance to it. It doesn't free us from getting away from what's going on. And how does Paul conclude Romans 11? By by praising God for the mystery of His will, saying that His purposes are beyond comprehension, and God is doing something that I don't fully understand. Paul says under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, but we need to worship Him, and so I think that's probably a better place to go with this.
I think what I would just add is that what I think those who make this criticism are missing, or let me put it another way. What I think they're doing is they are treating the situation as if the only factor involved is one's mercy, and so Paul on their objection seems more desirous of mercying Israel than even God is, but there's more to the matter than just mercy. God's purposes go well beyond the purposes of a mere creature, and His knowledge and His wisdom go far beyond any mere creature, including Paul. And so I think when you try to make the argument, when you try to reduce and flatten it out to just simply whether Paul or God is more merciful, ignoring other factors that Paul may not be aware of, that Paul may not be sufficiently righteous enough to consider, when you bring in things that the fact that God is transcendent and omniscient and all these things, there's much more at play than merely the attribute of mercy, and so I think that's my problem with the objection.
I agree. There are a number of statements of divine purpose throughout, and mercy is really a means to an end. Paul will talk about how looking back at Romans 9-11 and 15:8 and 9, about how God's purposes are being realized so that the Gentiles will praise Him for His mercy, right? So, like you said, mercy isn't what's ultimate. What's ultimate is God's praise, God's revelation, God's purpose, as we're going to see in chapter 9. So mercy is a means to a greater end.
Yeah. All right. So let's start digging in here in verses 6 to 13, and feel free to hone in on any particular detail that you think is important. But let me start kicking things off by asking you a question. But first, let me make a statement. So as we're going to discuss the examples from the Old Testament that Paul uses here, the choice on God's part to name Abraham's offspring through Isaac specifically, and not through, say, Ishmael, and God's choice to elect Jacob over Esau for His purposes. These Old Testament examples that he offers aren't about election unto salvation in the sense that we as Calvinists mean when we talk about unconditional election. So maybe we could start by asking and answering the question, if the examples Paul offers here aren't salvific examples, or rather examples of God's salvific election, but are instead examples of election unto service, as Leighton Flowers would put it. Why then should we assume that these examples can lend themselves as support to salvific unconditional election?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's an important question. I think that's the strongest. If I were convinced of an Arminian theology, that's the place that I would want to focus as well. But there are some shortcomings to it, and what I want to do here is focus on Paul's Greek in order to see what's emphatic. But we should do another episode on Paul's use of the Old Testament, because that is also a really, really important point and significant. But so I'm going to be very brief. If you are going to take some time to learn about how Jewish people interpreted the Old Testament, this would be a really great book to start with. This is by Richard Longenecker, Biblical Exegesis in the Apostolic Period. And he goes through all the different Jewish conventions of interpretation and shows how they're evident in the New Testament. And particularly Paul uses in Romans 4 and here in Romans 9, a kind of interpretation called midrash. And specifically, he's using a device where he's linking texts up because of their correspondences with particular words, such as calling, such as mercy, seed, children, these sorts of things. And so you look at these texts, and he's connecting some dots. But if what we do then is recognize that Paul is alluding to or citing the Old Testament, and then go to the Old Testament and interpret those texts and bring those meanings into Romans 9, we might be missing Paul's point, because what I'm going to highlight here is there are a number of places where Paul draws out a theological inference from the text that he cites, and those tell us what Paul is doing with the text himself. So we can grant a whole lot that the other interpreters want to say about the Old Testament background. A really good example is Brian Abishano's. It's going to be, when it's done, it's going to be 3 volumes on Romans chapter 9. It's very good stuff, and he spends a significant amount of time looking at the Old Testament, but then he brings that into Paul, and it seems to be negating the theological inferences that Paul is drawing out. So I don't think there's enough of an appreciation of the interpretive device that Paul is using. He's drawing principles out of these texts in order to mount a theological case to explain why only some in Israel have received mercy and not all have received mercy. And when we pay attention to those markers, we can see that he's doing something that I think has been missed by some interpreters.
Okay, but just as a way to sort of prime our viewers for
Sure.
understanding what it is that we're going to be arguing from the text, would you say that the reason why these examples do lend themselves as in Paul's hands as support for unconditional election is because it's not that Paul is offering these examples of unconditional election unto salvation, but rather what Paul is doing is using them as proof that God's call is not merely an invitation that must be received by people meeting particular conditions, but rather is something more sovereign, to use a word that you in a way.
Yes.
Yeah, is that sort of the way that you would say he's leveraging these examples?
I think so. So when we get to the inference that he draws, especially from Jacob and Esau's narrative, he says that God made his choice before the two were born or had done anything good or evil. You don't find that inference in the Old Testament text. That's Paul telling you how he's using that text and the theological point that he's milking from that text. And so and that's the elimination of all conditions on the part of the human as the basis of God's choice to extend mercy. And instead of appealing to the human act or the human will, several times throughout he talks about the divine will or the divine call. And so that's what we need to see there. So yeah, I agree with you that's what's going on, and I think we'll see that when we walk through the text.
Okay. Well, one thing I think that you wanted to hone in on was Paul's use of the verb coletto here in verse 7, where he quotes the Old Testament and says, "Through Isaac shall your offspring be named." That word, the English word "named" there is a arguably an imperfect translation of the word coletto there. But what's interesting is the word appears all throughout Romans 9, but not after Romans 9, and only twice before Romans 9, once in 4:17 and once in 8:30. And I think you and I would argue that this calling that Paul is referring to, because it's the word that he uses in Romans 4:17 and 8:30, means something a little bit more than merely an invitation, which is the way Leighton, I think it's the very word that Leighton uses to describe the call here. If I'm right about that, unpack that for us. How does the word coletto and the way Paul uses it here suggest that there's something more than just mere invitation?
Yeah, so you referenced Romans 4:17 and 8:28 through 30, where that language is used prior. And there, in Romans 4:17, God's calling is described as the creation of life ex nihilo. So I think Paul is building on his Jewish theology of the Word of God. It's creative. When God speaks, Genesis 1, things happen. And an interesting parallel to this would be 2 Corinthians 4:6, where Paul says, the God who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," has caused the light of has shined the light of the knowledge of the glory of God within us, so that we see God's glory in the face of Jesus. I just butchered that citation,
That's
but
all right.
your viewers can go back and listen to it. It's an appeal to the creation narrative, saying that this is what happened. God did a new creation miracle, and that's what the birth of Isaac is described as in Romans chapter 4, verse 17. And then in Romans 8, 28 through 30, grounded in God's foreloving, his forechoosing, God puts that into reality through predestination and calling, which I think happens in conjunction with the gospel preached. And it's presented as a creational call. It results in justification. And if you look at Paul's language of justification throughout Romans, a lot of times interpreters reduce it to a forensic metaphor and seeing this as acquittal, being found not guilty, and it certainly is that. But there are a number of places, especially in Romans 4 and 5, and really going on through, where to be justified is to share in the new creation, is to have. He talks about righteousness that produces life, right? So this is much more miraculous than is sometimes appreciated. And for Paul, the grammar of Romans 8, 28 through 30 is very, very powerful. It's only those and all those whom he foreknew, predestined, called, justified, and glorified. They are carried through in this whole process, and it climaxes with nothing can separate us from the love of God. But you have the call right there in the middle. That's how God puts that into effect. And so Paul is building on, again, as I mentioned earlier, through that midrashic device, he's connecting texts that talk about the call. And here the call creates God's people. God's naming his seed through Isaac, and rather than through Ishmael, is to create a people that is limited in scope. Not every child of Abraham is among the called, and it happened by God's choosing. And then that gets spelled out more explicitly in the very next example, when this is in accordance with God's choice before they were born and had done anything good or evil. So this isn't an invitation. God called Isaac not as an invitation, but Paul says as a creation out of nothing. And it's interesting. Don't mean to be too long. If you were to go to 2 Clement, chapter 1, verses 7 through 8, which is an early writing in the collection called the Apostolic Fathers, some of the earliest post-New Testament Christian writings we have, he seems to be building on this and drawing out some of the same inferences. And I'm going to just read that real quick. We didn't prepare beforehand, so I don't know if you can pull it up at some point. But he says, "For he had mercy upon us, and in his compassion he saved us when we had no hope of salvation except that which comes from him. And even though he had seen in us much deception and destruction, for he called us when we did not exist, and out of nothing he willed us into being." So he's reading Romans, especially chapters 8 and 9, as God's calling being something that creates life where there's only death. And so I think we're missing a lot of what's going on in the text if we reduce it in that way to just an invitation.
Well, you brought up Romans 8, 29, 30, and I wanted to ask you about this question in verse 29 of Romans 8, prognosko. You and I, you referred to it as for choosing, for loving, and I think you're right to do so. But and we could go into a lot of detail into why. I mean, this language of knowing, when God knows persons, it's not about knowledge about the person. It's about a choice to love a person. And what Paul seems to be saying is that God chose beforehand to love these people. He chose to enter into a relationship with them. But what Leighton has argued is that this word prognosko, translated foreknew in Romans 8:29, he argues something a little bit unique that I have never heard somebody argue before, which is that what it actually means is these are the people that he knew previously, namely referring to Old Testament saints here. And as support for that, he points to the only other place in Romans where prognosko is used, which is Romans 11:2, where Paul says God has not rejected his people Israel, whom he foreknew. Leighton would argue that this means that God has not rejected the people that he knew previously to now, namely the Jews, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. How would you respond to that? And why do you think that prognosko, even in Romans 11:2, doesn't mean the people that God knew previously, but rather the people that God has, chosen to enter into relationship to, in the same way that we take it to mean in Romans 8:29?
Yeah, so if it's a strange view that he argues for. I wrote my master's thesis on this, looking at it both in the Jewish context as well as the language in Paul specifically. And what you find there is, even among a diversity of different kinds of scholars, this language of foreknew or foreknowledge, you get it also in 1 Peter chapter 1. Nobody believes that it means anything like prescience. Like it has to do with God's choosing, God's electing love, his electing knowledge. And you get this really, really explicitly tied to predestination in texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls called the Hodayot, or the Thanksgiving hymns, and there God's knowledge is a creative knowledge, right? And so you think about this theologically, and I'm more of an exegete and less of a theologian, but if God knows something and God's knowledge is powerful, then that something has to happen. Otherwise, God's knowledge was wrong, right? And so for God to know something is different from us knowing something. Us knowing something doesn't create any reality, but for the Covenanters at Qumran, it was a creative reality. Nothing happens, the text says, apart from God's knowledge. God's knowledge makes that thing happen. And so when the text talks about God knowing a people, again, we're talking about him creating a people. And it's really interesting, the appeal to Romans 11:2, because he says, the foreknown are Israel. But what's the end result of God's foreknowledge of them? He tells us God has not rejected those whom he foreknew, and he will save all Israel, right? So whoever those foreknown, his foreknowledge is an effectual foreknowledge that is going to ultimately result in them receiving mercy and being saved, as the passage concludes. So I don't think there's a strong case to be had there, and I would point to a lot of lexical evidence. I would say that if you just begin with BDAG, the Standard Greek Lexicon, look in the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, you're going to get scores of examples going back into the Hebrew Old Testament and into intertestamental Judaism, and you're going to see a lot of examples of places where God's knowledge of people isn't as he explains it, but it's a choosing knowledge, it's an electing knowledge, and it's a creating knowledge.
Yeah, which makes Romans 8:29 and 30 really powerful evidence, I think, for unconditional election, because it's saying there's this group of people that God chose in advance to enter into relationship with, and it's those people that he predestined, those and those alone, and all of those he predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, and those people he called also, and those he, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's really powerful evidence, and I'd love to see a debate on just the thought that foreknew there means knew previously, as Leighton Flowers has argued. But anyway, let's return to Romans 9 then. And in the notes that you sent me before we started recording, you said that this phrase at the beginning of verse 8, tut estin, that is. You said that is probably the most important aspect of the Greek here in Romans 9, because it clues, or not the specific phrase, but phrases like it, markers of interpretation or inference. Explain to us why these markers are so important, and so that viewers can keep their eye open for it as we continue through the text.
Okay, so this is really helpful. This is Logos Bible software, and it has a function for the Greek. I don't know if it does it for English, where you can have it lay it out in these clausal propositional outlines, and then on the left there you have it telling you essentially the function of the clause or the proposition. And so it's a very good way to dig in and see what's going on emphatically here. And there are a number of markers throughout Romans 9 that clue you in that way on what Paul's point is. So you get one in verse 6 where he says, for it is not, or they are not all Israel who are of Israel, right? So he's building up he's establishing grounds or reason there, and you get some markers of cause and markers of purpose. And as you pointed out, what I've really highlighted is in verse 8, which follows the first quotation from the Old Testament. In Isaac shall your seed be called, or your descendant be called. It's the Greek word sperma there. He says this is taut estin. And he tells us what the interpretation is, like what principle he's drawing from this. So whatever we think Paul is doing with the Old Testament, we need to begin by asking what interpretive principles does he draw out of the passages that he cites. And there's a number of them throughout, as he cites many Old Testament passages from Israel's early narratives. So in this one, in verse 8, he says that is, so what's the point of my citation from the story of Isaac's calling and God calling Abraham's seed in Isaac? He says that is the children of it is not the he says that means it is not the children of the flesh who are children of God, but the children of promise are counted as offspring. So Paul is already building in here an inference from the specific choice in Isaac rather than in all of Abraham's children, Isaac and Ishmael. He is finding in here a marker of God's selective choice, even among Israelites, descendants of Abraham, and putting a limit on the scope of the divine mercy according to God's naming, his calling, his promise even is the language that's used there in verse 8. So that would be one of the first, I think that is the first inference that Paul draws out, looking at Israel in terms of a promissory remnant, and not in universal terms every son of Abraham. And that language of promissory Israel is one I borrowed from Michael Bird. His pretty recent commentary on Romans is helpful, and I like that term, promissory Israel. It's about who are the beneficiaries of the divine promise.
And be sure as we go through the text, if I pass one of these markers that you're talking about without noticing it myself, let me know and we can dig in. But the next important thing that I have from you in your notes is the gar, the inferential gar at the beginning of verse 11, where Paul says, for it is before they were yet born and had done nothing good or bad, etc. So tell us how this marker, this gar at the beginning of verse 11, how it what it indicates is the point that Paul is trying to draw from the example of Jacob and Esau.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's the thing. Again, we're always going back. What is Paul wringing from this text? And the gar clues us in on what he's doing here. And so this is the text that talks, of course, about Rebecca conceiving twins, and it's very emphatic. It says so. If you're looking at the narrative of Isaac and Ishmael, there's a reversal of worldly systems of worth, particularly with patriarchy, right? And so he chooses the younger instead of the firstborn son. But you could make the argument there that, well, the reason why is because Hagar was one of Sarah's servants, whereas Sarah is his wife, and so of course there's a privileging there culturally, right? But then when we get into the story of the conception of Jacob and Esau, it says very emphatically in the Greek, it was by one man, and it says it was by one act of, it's the Greek word koites, which is, you get coitus, which is an act of sexual intercourse. The very same, like there's nothing that distinguishes these two in any worldly system of value, and in that context, you have the choice of Jacob over Esau, the older serving the younger, as he says. And so in verse 11, you get these. You get the gar marking that we're dealing with an interpretation, and you get some negated concessive participles. So he says, it was although neither had done anything good or evil, and even that, the inclusion of the word anything is interesting. Paul could have just said, although they hadn't done good or evil, but he adds the indefinite pronoun there. And this is one of those places where slowing down, looking at the Greek, makes you think like, what's Paul, emphasizing here? And he adds that word anything to tell you that there is absolutely no basis in anything these individuals did. It couldn't have been, because this happened before they were born, right? So there's no cultural markers of worth, and there's no action that God took into account to condition his choice. And so then you get another important discourse marker at the end of verse 11, where you have the hina clause. What is the condition, right? So there's no condition in Jacob or Esau. No reason why God rejected Esau is listening, and no reason why he chose Jacob is listed. But he does say that it was in order that his purpose according to election might remain. That is the condition that is laid out. It's the divine purpose, right? Okay, so after giving the hina clause that it's according, it's God's purpose to carry forth, to cause to remain his purpose according to election. The grounds of that are expressed both negatively and positively in verse 12. So it is not according to works, but from the one who calls. And it's interesting the way that Paul says this here too. Again, Greek makes you slow down. So he says not works, right? So there you've got the abstract concept of works, but what's the antithesis? Not calling, but you've got the definite article there, right? The one who calls, right? So it's not grounded on anybody's works, but it is grounded on the one who calls. Who's the one who calls? God. Right? So this is God's doing, not anybody else's doing. And again, it's made emphatic. And I also want to highlight that this is an antithesis here. And Romans is notorious for its antithesis, right? So antitheses. So you've got the grace versus law antithesis, and you've got the faith versus works antithesis. But Paul doesn't carry over the faith versus works antithesis here, does he? Look at his antithesis is not with faith and works, but with works and divine calling, right? And so this is, again, taking us out of the realm of conditions that human beings might meet and placing us in the realm of the actions that the free God performs. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so this is a really important thing to highlight in order to see, again, the principles that Paul is drawing out here. And he validates this by another reference to scripture. Again, the older will serve the younger. And then verse 13, just as it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. And I think that language of loved and hated is election and non-election language primarily. It's if a Calvinist wants to look at this and say, oh, that means that Esau was eternally reprobate, I think they're moving too much into it. It just means that he's not the chosen one through whom God would create his seed by virtue of calling. So anyways, yeah, maybe we can see where we want to go from there.
So it's at this point that we first encounter in Romans 9, or at least it seems to me this is the first example of what's called the hypothetical objector, who is hypothetically responding to what Paul has said with, is there injustice on God's part? We Calvinists have often pointed to the hypothetical objectors in Romans 9 as an indication that our understanding of what Paul is saying is right, because our understanding is what prompts the very hypothetical objections and the very non-hypothetical, the very actual the objections that non-Calvinists offer look like the kinds of objections that Paul represents in this hypothetical objection. We're going to continue here in a second, but is there anything you want to say about verse 14 and the hypothetical objection that if everything Paul has just inferred from those texts is true, does that mean that God is unjust? Anything you want to say about this verse?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're raising an objection, like you said, that those who want to ground God's choice and God's calling in some kind of prior condition. Like, I think we go too far when we say that if the condition of election was faith, then it's based on works. When I hear Calvinists say that, I say, well, no, that doesn't work with Paul.
Agree.
Like there's a contrast between faith and works that's very important in Paul. But what is emphatic here is that there are no conditions, and that is why the objection is raised. And we're going to see in verse 16 that the fact that there are no conditions is taken up to a new level in Paul's inference there, but we'll get there in time. And so I think that regardless of objections to the contrary, what we get here is a question: is God unjust? Is God arbitrary? And Paul's answer is an emphatic no, absolutely not. And that me genoita, even the thought is not agreeable, that sort of thing. So I think this and the objection, what is it in verse 19, who resists his will? Why does he still find fault for who resists his will? I think both of these are much better explained if Paul is talking about God choosing one to the rejection of another on the basis of no conditions in the human being. It would seem more intuitively that it is more just of God to choose on the basis of some condition, some good or some evil that they had done. But he says, no, it's based simply on the one who calls. It's God's choice through and through.
It reminds me of the hypothetical objector in Romans 3, after Paul has been talking about Gentiles and Jews being on the same ground, as it were. The hypothetical objector says, what if some were unfaithful? Does their faithfulness nullify the faithfulness of God? And Leighton Flowers has argued that the hypothetical objector here in Romans 9 is like that hypothetical objector in Romans 3, not objecting to a claim of unconditional election or theological determinism, but to something having to do with Israel specifically. And as you and I began this conversation saying, what Paul is addressing here in Romans 9 is very much focused on the question of Israel. So how would you, this objection, what should we say then? Is there injustice on God's part? By no means, Paul says. If that is specifically about Israel and the way that Paul is answering the question of Israel, does that mean that he's or does that challenge at all our interpretation of this text as a hypothetical objection to God calling not purely by his own will and not by any sort of condition that's met by the people he calls?
Yeah, so in Romans 3, Paul is still building his case with regard to justification. When we get to Romans 11, you already talked about the kind of unique concentration, or Romans 9 through 11, about the unique concentration of calling language. There's also a unique concentration of mercy language. In fact, that term is not used anywhere prior to Romans chapter 9, and it's only used again after chapter 11, looking back and reflecting on what's going on in chapters 9 through 11 on my reading. And so here we're dealing with the issue of justification. And if anything's emphatic in Romans is that there is a condition for justification, and that's faith. We're justified by faith, right? That's a condition. And so at this point, if we flatten out the distinctives here, where Paul is mounting a case that universally no one will be justified by the law, as he'll conclude in the climax of this argument, in order to say that now the righteousness of God has come apart from the law, and that it's not on the basis of works, but on the basis of faith for everyone who believes. If we flatten that out and don't see what's unique, when Paul is bringing up unique terms and a unique situation, a unique problem with Israel's story in chapters 9, then we're doing damage to Paul's argument, I think. And so even though it's very much in the same spirit and it's very much a Jewish objector, of course it's a Jewish person who's going to be offended by Paul saying that just because you're a child of Abraham doesn't mean you're part of the called people, right? And again, he's going to get even more offensive. He never lessens the offense; he increases the offense. It ramps up. So I don't think that that's an argument that gains any traction that I see as any problem for my view. Paul's whole point is that when he talks about whether or not God is faithful, he's saying that despite the unbelief of Israel, God's faithfulness is still established in what he's doing through Christ. And ultimately, even his faithfulness to Israel, Romans chapter 11 is going to tell us, is going to come to fruition. They're enemies of the gospel now, he says, but they will believe. God will remove their hardening condition, and all Israel will be saved. So even if we want to say he's telegraphing what's happening in Romans 9 to 11, what we could say, I think, is that God's not done with Israel. Their unfaithfulness isn't nullifying God's faithfulness. He's going to make his faithfulness an effective, actual reality, and that's where, again, Romans 11 climaxes.
Okay. Well, returning to verses 14 and 15 of Romans 9, it's interesting the way that Paul substantiates his absolute insistence that there's not injustice on God's part. So he raises he raises the hypothetical objection: is there injustice on God's part? And then, as you point out, he says, "Me genoita, by no means, may it not be," right? And to substantiate that, there's inferential gar there. To substantiate his denial of that, he quotes this text in which God, speaking of Pharaoh, says, "I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion." And what's interesting to me is, at least on the way I'm looking at it, 2,000 years removed from when Paul is writing, I don't see how this is substantiation of the fact that God is not unjust if what Paul is saying is true. So can you help me to understand and viewers to understand, how is it that this appeal of Paul to this text from the Old Testament about mercy and compassion, how does that substantiate his absolute denial that this makes God unjust?
Yeah, so the citation is actually not from the Pharaoh narrative. It's from the fallout of the golden calf incident and Moses' intercession after. Yeah, Sorry. So it's from Exodus 33:19. That's okay. And here, this is where God determines to have mercy, even though Israel deserves to be wiped out, and for God to start over through Moses. And it's part of the revelation of God's name. And if I already referenced Piper's book, but he's got a chapter on this that I can't do justice to right now. But he's got a whole chapter on this reference, and it's very good and very important. But think about what's going on here. So there's the question of injustice. If Paul is not saying that God's election, God's calling are unconditional, then what Paul should have done is said, look, they didn't meet the condition. But that's not what he does. He appeals to a text that says God has mercy as he desires and compassion as he desires. And it even gets intensified again when we do get to the story of Pharaoh as well. And so this is about God's choice and free determination to preserve a people from among the Israelites. And it's interesting, when you go to that narrative, a number of them are destroyed in judgment, but he chooses to save some, even though according to his own words, God's own words in the text, they all deserve to be wiped out. He destroys a portion of them and has mercy on the other portion. On what basis? I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. And that doesn't work, again, in a conditional reading of this text that says that calling is conditional, God's election is conditional. It does work in ours where we say that it's unconditioned. And that takes us in, if I could jump into verse 16,
yeah, sure.
to another inference. And this one is an emphatic inference. You have two inferential particles here. You have ara, un. So if we were to translate that really literally, it would be so then, therefore, right? Like it seems redundant, but he's saying, like, hey, perk up and look at what I'm saying right here. This is emphatic. And this is the principle, again, he draws out from the reference that he gives, and really I think everything leading up to this. And notice how he escalates the denials here. Okay, so now it is not of the one willing, right? And it is not the one running, striving, but of the mercy in God, or the God God who has mercy. Maybe you would say the merciful God. There's a number of ways we could translate that. So you've got two denials, ou and oude, not and neither. And this time it's not a denial that it's according to works or according to anything they had done, good or evil. He adds in another element here, not according to will. Isn't that interesting? So whatever we say about faith, I think everybody agrees that faith is an act of the human will. But Paul is saying that there isn't an act of the will on the part of the human being that conditions God's choice and God's election here. I don't want to press it too hard and say that this excludes faith as a condition, but I think it creates a tension, if that's what we're trying to say here, that doesn't need to be made. What is the contrast? It is not willing, it is not working or striving, but it is God's mercy. God's mercy is uncoerced, it's unconditioned, it's free, according to the inference that Paul is drawing out from his argument and from the text that he cites here.
Well, and so he goes on to further substantiate this inference that it depends not on human will or on exertion, but on God, who has mercy, by appealing to what I said earlier incorrectly, which was the Pharaoh narrative. So he goes on to say, Gar, there's that inferential Gar again.
Yep.
The scripture says to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I have raised you up, that I might show my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. And by the way, this to me is strong evidence of theological determinism. Not just unconditional election, because there's a lot more. Very often Leighton Flowers and other non-Calvinists will use analogies like a master chess player or a master judo artist or something like that, where God can bring about his intended victory, his intended ends, through the libertarian free choices of free agents. But there's a whole lot more to raising Pharaoh up for the purpose that God did in that he's referring to here, than merely reacting to or working through the libertarian choices of free agents. I mean, just think of the lifetime of events, lifetime of experiences that would have gone into Pharaoh's growth and development and maturity that would have led him to become the kind of character that he was, in order to be used in the way that God used it. It's just inconceivable to me, and maybe this is just my limitations, that raising Pharaoh up with the purpose that God is doing here could possibly be merely God working through libertarian free agents. But of course, we're not here today talking about theological determinism per se. We're talking about unconditional election. So let me hand it over to you. When Paul, is there anything you want to draw out from this inference that Paul makes from this from this Pharaoh narrative in his further substantiating and as you said, escalating his emphasis that this all depends, that God's calling depends not on human will or exertion, but on God who has mercy? Walk us through how, anything important to pull out from verse 17 here.
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting stuff here, especially when you compare Paul's quotation. So he says, the scripture says, right? So he's introducing a quotation here. And again, you have the gar, so it's a validation of the inference he had just made. And what's interesting, though, is when you compare Paul's quotation to what you get in the Hebrew, the Masoretic text, and in the LXX, Paul has made, the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, Paul has made some changes that are pretty telling about what he's saying. So first, when he cites it, in the Septuagint, it has henikin tautu, which is for the sake of this, right? Which still says that this is the divine purpose. But Paul's expression is more emphatic. When he has eis auta tauta, that, according to BDF, which is the standard reference grammar for Greek, that is an expression that means just this and nothing else. Like, this is it, the one and only purpose. It's for this very purpose and no other reason at all. And then you get those purpose clauses in parallel, which I'll get to in a second, introduced by hopos and two subjunctive verbs. But there's another change as well. Paul says that God raised him up, and you brought up the idea of determinism, and I think that's a valid point to make. So in the Hebrew, it has, I caused you to stand, which might communicate the idea that what God did was confirm and increase his resistance, right? And then in the Septuagint, it has a compound verb, dia tereo, which is to keep, but it's intensified. So the idea there might be, even though I could have wiped you out, I preserved you in response to what you were doing. But Paul doesn't accept either of those. For Paul, God didn't cause Pharaoh to stand, and God didn't keep Pharaoh. Paul says God established him here, or raised him up, right? So the whole scenario is something that God has orchestrated according to Paul. God put this whole thing in place, and he did it for his very particular purposes, and those were to show my power in you, right? I wanted to do it in you, and again, it's my power and it's my name. Again, the emphasis on what God wants to do here, as has been iterative throughout the text. And so he's showing forth his power, and he's proclaiming his name in all the earth. And so I think when we notice those distinctions in the versions, and then come over to see Paul's quotation, we get some more clues here, looking at his Greek, about what's really emphatic for him. And again, you've got the mu, my power, my name. God is doing what God wants to do. And again, we get another inference in verse 18, which we'll get to in a minute, that highlights that again.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
No, that's really interesting. I wasn't aware of how Paul repurposes and indeed changes. I mean, changes is a strong word, but he paraphrases, let's say,
Sure.
and yeah, I mean, somewhat changes what it is that the normative Greek text that they would have used, what it actually says. You're right. If our non-Calvinist interlocutors might have something if Paul had just quoted from the Septuagint or
Yes.
from a more literal translation of the Masoretic text, but he does something interesting there that is a little bit stronger. And then, as you say, he goes on to infer not just. So let's turn to verse 18 now. Paul goes on to infer not just that God has mercy on whom he has mercy, and as he had said earlier, have compassion on whom I have compassion. He takes it yet a step further. There's the escalation that you're talking about. Yep. He not only has mercy on whomever he wills, but he also hardens whomever he wills. Yep. And one thing that I want to point out about this thing in verse 18 is that if you go back and look at the early chapters of Exodus, where this language of God hardening Pharaoh's heart happens, very often non-Calvinists will claim that the first one that is said to harden Pharaoh's heart is actually Pharaoh himself. And they will use that as support for the notion that God is only hardening somebody who has already chosen to harden himself, right? Yeah. But if you actually walk through the Exodus narrative, the first hardening that's mentioned is when God tells Moses at the burning bush that you will go talk to Pharaoh, but I will harden his heart. And then the very next time that that hardening Pharaoh's heart is mentioned is when Pharaoh is said to harden his heart. In other words, Pharaoh hardening his heart is God hardening Pharaoh's heart. And I think that's really important. But that's not necessarily either here.
Let me say something about that real quick. If you actually go through and analyze carefully the Hebrew, we make a lot of assumptions in that text about what's going on in the English. And so G.K. Beale published an article in the Trinity Journal, I think like in the 80s, and you can find it online. And he goes through every instance grammatically of what's going on there in the in the hardening accounts. And it's very interesting. So in English, it says something like Pharaoh's heart was hardened. And we read that in English and we say, oh, well, that sounds like it's kind of like this passive thing, and it doesn't specify who the agent is or something like that, and or it'll say the heart of Pharaoh was hardened, right? And so the language, it sounds like it's saying there that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. It actually only says that explicitly twice in the whole narrative, and other than that, the idea here is that it's telling us the condition of Pharaoh's heart, and this can be spelled out with the grammar, with Paul's use of the PL and on the, or not Paul's, Paul wrote Exodus.
Yeah,
Moses, where he's using the PL and the Hifil stem, and you look at the grammar, and what's going on there is actually there really are only a couple times where it says that Pharaoh hardened his heart, and the rest of it, based on what you said, not just at the beginning of the narrative, but at the end, where we're looking here, like Paul reflecting back on it, Moses reflecting back on it. The whole point is that Yahweh hardened Pharaoh's heart. That's the big picture point of the text. But even when you drill down into those details, it's a lot weaker of a case for those who want to give priority to Pharaoh's hardening. And what I always say is, of course, Pharaoh hardened his heart, right? So some prophet from an enslaved people comes and says, "You're going to release my free workforce because Yahweh says so." And I don't even know who Yahweh is, and I'm the king of Egypt, the most powerful nation in the world. I'm a son of God, and of course he's going to harden his heart there. But as the plagues progress and get worse and worse, then God does not allow Pharaoh to do what would have become expedient, which would be to just cut ties and let them go. Things have gone from bad to worse, but Pharaoh doesn't have free will in this scenario at all, right? God says, "I'm going to use you to do what I intend to do. I'm going to make my power and my name known throughout the world," and that's the point that is consistent with what Paul is drawing out of it as well. So I think even when we do careful exegesis in Exodus, it's much stronger case for what you and I would want to say from it. And if I haven't sent you that article by Beale, I will. I highly recommend that anybody interested in that look at it. It's pretty technical. It gets into the fine details of Hebrew grammar, but it's very compelling.
Yeah, no, please do send me that article. And I had not read Piper's book, and so I'm also going to get that. But just to sort of reiterate what I said before returning to Romans, here's Exodus 7 that I'm showing up on the screen, and you can see that in verse 3, Yahweh says, "I will harden Pharaoh's heart." The next use is later in chapter 7, very same chapter, verse 13, Pharaoh's heart was hardened. So the very first time that God's promise to harden Pharaoh's heart, back in chapter 4, and then again in chapter 7, the very first substantiation, or the very first time Pharaoh's heart is hardened in the narrative, and not just anticipated, predicted in advance, is verse 13 here in chapter 7. So the Pharaoh's hardening from start to finish is ultimately Yahweh's action, and not.
Yes.
And just to be clear, I think you said Pharaoh had no free will. I imagine you mean free will in the libertarian sense, right? Because
yes, of course.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's return to Romans 9 then. And, I mean, anything more that you want to say about verse 18, this inference from the... Yeah, please do.
Yeah, so in verse 16, when he drew the inference, it said that God's choice or God's mercy was not according to the one who wills or the one who runs, but according to the God who has mercy. Now the inference twice repeats a verbal form, right, of willing, coletto, and or thello, is it? I'm sorry. Yeah, thello is the lexical form. And he says God has mercy on whom he wills, and he hardens whom he wills, right? So it's not according to the human will that conditions God's mercy back in 16. And now he tells us whose will it is according to. And in both places, both mercy and hardening, in this inference that Paul is drawing out, it is God's will that is primary. And so any reading where we say that the reason why Israel is either hardened or a beneficiary of mercy, that conditions it on a human act of volition, is missing Paul's point. Paul's point is that it's all about the divine volition here.
Yeah. Yeah, and this brings us to verse 19 and the next hypothetical objection. And, you know, this again, even Leighton Flowers acknowledges that what's critical to properly understanding what Paul is saying here in Romans 9 is to understand the hypothetical objection that he brings up here in verse 19. And as I said before, or as I tried to explain before, but I think didn't do as good of a job as I'm going to try to do now, I think what Leighton argues is that the objection here on the hypothetical objector's part is who can who is going to be able to resist God's will to choose from among Gentiles and not merely Israel, as if that's somehow unjust. But as you've been pointing out, when we get to this point in Paul's argument, the inferences that Paul has been drawing from these various texts is that it all depends not at all on the human will, but on God's will, and
Yes.
that to me seems like that leads exactly to this hypothetical objection, and I don't see the hypothetical objection that Leighton thinks this is as something that would naturally flow at all from these appeals that Paul has been making to the Old Testament text. Would you agree?
I totally agree. And here you have so he uses a different word that the English brings over as will, and it's bulema. And what's interesting there is that's also used in Ephesians 1:11, or maybe it's a cognate. And here it is his purpose or decision or decree. This is a term that's used to describe a kingly decree. So the objection is that God has written something into place that cannot be overturned, and so it's wrong for God to find fault in us, because this is the script that he's written, and Paul won't allow that. Right in verse 20, you have no basis on which to question what God is at work doing. But think about it though. What Israelite would say, well, God can't choose one and not the rest? Like, doesn't his choice of Abraham out of all the families of the earth fall under that sort of objection as well? God didn't choose all the other nations, but he chose Abraham. So if God did that, why can't God do that in choosing particular sons and again, for his purposes in taking his blessing to the nations? I don't think that argument gets off the ground at all. I think it makes a lot more sense, especially based on what we've been seeing, to understand that they're objecting to God, again, using the argument that Leighton made, appearing arbitrary and yet holding them accountable for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think Leighton's reading of this hypothetical objection could be plausible if all Paul had appealed to was Isaac and Jacob, but he also appeals to Pharaoh.
Yes.
And that's what really sort of it's the apex of this escalation that Paul has been doing. He appeals to Pharaoh, which isn't at all about choosing one people over another. It's about hardening somebody by God's sovereign will, and that is what naturally leads to the hypothetical objection. Now, in the notes you sent me, you make a good point about verse 20, that Paul doesn't, when Paul had appealed earlier to the previous hypothetical objection, the what shall we say then, is there injustice on God's part? Paul appeals to Yahweh's actions in history as proof that that what he inferred was true. All right, but when we get to 20, his answer to the hypothetical objection isn't, well, look, at what God has done. I mean, he does indirectly by quoting the Old Testament, and I'll turn to you for that in a second. But his first answer is, who are you, O man, to answer back to God? And you make a good point in the notes you sent me. You said, you asked the question, does Paul here really answer the objection, or does he malign those who would even ask it? How do you respond to that question? Is Paul answering his question by simply, or is he answering the question by merely maligning somebody who would ask it, or is there something more going on?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's some debate in the scholarly literature about whether or not we can call Romans 9 a theodicy, and that question of theodicy is one that comes up a lot here, because one of the real popular arguments is that we need to maintain libertarian free will, because otherwise we can't explain all the evil and horrible things that go on in the world, but some scholars will we'll call Romans 9 a theodicy, but then they'll look at this and say, that's not justification. That's saying that you can't even ask the question, right? So is Paul interested in giving a theodicy? I've read arguments on both sides, and I understand where both are coming from. Maybe he is, and he's appealing, again, the background here, the citation that we get next is based on Isaiah 29:16 and Isaiah 45:9, where where Yahweh talks about what he's doing with Israel, and them saying, what are you doing? It doesn't look like you're very intelligent. You're a very skillful potter. Why didn't you make me this way, etc. And Paul's whole point is that it's ridiculous that the pot should do that, and that's the point that he draws out in verse 21, where he says the potter has you get the right in some translations, but it's exousia, it's authority. The potter has authority to do what he wants with the clay, making one vessel for honorable use. And it's interesting. I didn't note this before, but here he has singular, right? So it's a vessel, singular, either for honor or for dishonor. And we've had singulars throughout. The one who wills versus the one who runs versus the God who has mercy, right? It's interesting that he's using these singulars throughout, telling us that he is addressing the question of why one Israelite believes and the other doesn't. And again, he keeps coming back to this idea of the potter's freedom. He wants to mold this clay on the one hand, in some cases, into a vessel for honor, and in other cases, one for dishonor. And again, we get it even more intensified as we go into verses 22 and 23.
Yeah. One thing I really like about verse 21 is how it lends itself to one of the illustrations I gave in last episode of the show on how election isn't arbitrary in Calvinism, because the way Leighton has characterized verse 21 is that God has two things before him, and he shapes one of them to be this vessel for honorable use and the other for dishonorable use. And if that were what was going on, arguably it could be arbitrary, precisely because he would be taking two pre-existing things and shaping them each. But no, this potter analogy is saying there's one thing, and the potter rips off from that lump of clay and crafts it into a vessel for honorable use, and then he rips off another piece and he shapes it for dishonorable use. He's not choosing from among two different things and then just sort of shaping them a little bit differently. He is crafting them from the ground up, from the same lump of clay, and I think that's really critical here.
It is. Let me say, follow up on that. So the article that I published in the Westminster Theological Journal has a big section on the book of Sirach, and particularly chapter 33, which I think is a tradition that's influenced Paul's use of this. It uses the potter clay analogy as well, but it grounds it very explicitly, which Paul doesn't explicitly do here. It grounds it in God's works at creation, right? So just as he makes certain days sanctified, holidays, and other days common, the text says that he does that, forming human paths, human destinies at creation. So I think that is very important background. If your viewers have a New Revised Standard Version, it will have the Apocrypha in it, and Sirach, or it's sometimes called Ecclesiasticus, or the Wisdom of Ben Sira, chapter 33, I believe it's verses 7 and following. You can see that, and I think it's pretty clear that that's the way Paul is using the potter clay analogy here.
Just out of curiosity, is your Westminster article available online for free, or do people have to subscribe?
It is if you are like a member of an institution. Usually you can get it on like the library website or something like that. I'm happy to share it. I don't think there are any copyrights being violated when I do, but do
you not have an academia profile?
I think I have one, but I don't think I've ever actually used it. I should and put it on there. Yeah.
Yeah, I would encourage you to do so. I think that's one. I've got articles that I've gotten a few articles published, and I never want the stuff I publish to be accessible to only a few people in the ivory tower, and so I put them up on my academia profile, and I'd encourage you to do the same. But even if you don't, make sure to send me after this the name of that article you wrote, and I'll be sure to try to at least give people the details they need to find it. But let me ask you a question before we move on to verse 22. Leighton has very often pointed out that at least in terms of the canonical text, Paul is appealing to or quoting from an Old Testament text in which God's shaping of these, having the right as a potter over the clay, he is actually shaping his choice to shape the clay in the way he does is actually contingent upon the choices or actions of the people that he's shaping. And Leighton has used that as reason to think that Paul isn't using this potter analogy as evidence that God is unconditionally electing some Jews over others, but rather that God's election is based first on the actions of the people that he's shaping. How would you respond to that? If that's the case, if in Isaiah, if or Jeremiah, wherever this potter thing is first used, if that's what God's doing, he's shaping in reaction to what they've done, why should we not assume that that's what Paul is arguing here?
Yeah, so that's part of the debate, is what the background is. Paul actually explicitly quotes from Isaiah, which the point in Isaiah's use of the potter clay analogy is to speak of the inscrutability of God's purposes for his people. Whereas in Jeremiah, the rhetorical point there is also using a different sort of potter clay analogy, where a potter can take something that isn't doing what it was intended to do, and he can mush the clay back up, and he can repurpose it and make it into something that works, right? And so Jeremiah's rhetorical point there, that's in Jeremiah chapter 18, is to encourage them, hey, don't stop, don't fail to remember that you need to repent, and that our God is powerful, and who knows what's going to happen if you repent, and so that's different though. Again, I don't think that's in the background for Paul here. I think Paul is alluding to what, and if you compare the text, it's not even really a question. Look at Isaiah 29, 16 and 45:9. It's very clear that that's the background. Paul has kind of mashed those two together in his citation here, and there it is about God's right to do what he wants, and those who are in the analogy, the pots, having no right to question that. And so and again, as we've been seeing, and as we're going to continue to see, the conditions in all of this are not found in the human beings. That's what Paul has been denying emphatically throughout. That's what he just denied in verse 18. What was it? Yeah. And he also denied back in verse 16, it's not according to the one who wills, but it's God's will. He mercies and he hardens as he wills. So I think that explanation pretty transparently gets away from the inferences that Paul is drawing out from his own analogies here.
Gotcha. Okay, well, take us then into verse 22. One of the let's start with this phrase "eide." What if? I have heard some non-Calvinists say. In fact, I think that my opponent in my debate book, which is it's off the screen, people can't see it right now, but I think even my opponent in that book made the case or argued that "eide," what if, is not expressing something that God will or has in fact done, but it's just sort of, well, maybe he could have, but he didn't actually. But is that what does "eide" or "what if" mean as Paul is using it? How is it functioning in what God is, or in what Paul is saying?
Yeah, I think it's another marker of his inference. Of course, it's not using the formal grammatical forms that we would expect for an inference. It is set up as as sort of a rhetorical, conditional question. But again, you've got the connections to everything that's come before, and he's told us God has mercy on whom he wants, and he hardens whom he wants, and that he is the potter with the right to do what he wants with the clay as he sees fit, and it's beyond scrutiny. And so that it's consistent, when he cited the story of Pharaoh and said that God wanted to show his power and to make known his name. Well, what do we have here? God willing, again, connecting it back, it's all about God's will, to show his wrath and to make known his power. So he's not introducing some hypothetical that, God could do it if he wanted to, but we know God's not like that. No, he's introducing this as a rhetorical way to say, yeah, this is what God is doing. It's not the end of the story. Get to Romans chapter 11, where for many, this group called all Israel, that hardening is going to be reversed, but not for everybody, unfortunately. But I don't think that works at all. Again, the inferences really head that argument off, because he's been explicitly telling us his point throughout is God having mercy on who he wants and hardening who he wants. And so again, I doubt that really works. And that's not something you find in the scholarly literature. I don't know of a single exegetical commentary that says that Paul is just being hypothetical and really doesn't think that God is like this. I don't. Right. They do have other interpretations, and there are really good commentaries. Not all the good commentaries on Romans, lean towards views like ours. There are really good commentaries from different perspectives, but none of them goes that direction. I think that's because there's not any good grounds for it.
Yeah. I take the what if here as something more like, so what if? Paul is saying, so what if God, desiring to show his wrath, et cetera, et cetera. It's not, maybe God does this. It's saying, so what if this is what he does? But and there may be more in this verse that you want to unpack. Definitely. But I know that one thing that is worth unpacking is Paul's use of the passive voice here in the word prepared, the Greek word katartidzo, right? So some have argued, as in the notes that you sent me indicate, that this word prepared isn't actually in the passive voice, it's in the middle voice. Now, I don't want to go too far into the weeds here, but for viewers' sake that aren't familiar with the terrain here, in English, we have two voices, active and passive. I hit the ball, the verb hit is active. I'm the subject of the verb, and the ball is the object of the verb, and the verb is transitive. All right, so that's at the active voice. I hit the ball. But if I said I was hit by the ball, well, now hit is in the passive voice. I'm the subject, but I'm also the one upon whom the action is being made. Yep. Greek, however, has this third voice that's called the middle voice, which is something like the person being both the subject and the object of the verb. It's acting in some way upon oneself. And one of the reasons, or one of the unfortunate things about certain tenses in Greek is that in some tenses, not all tenses, but in some tenses of Greek, the passive and the middle voice are identical in form. And that's the case here. If this were a middle voice, they prepared themselves for destruction. It would look identical if it's in one of those tenses. It would look identical to the passive voice. They were prepared for destruction. How do you respond to the claim, if many people make it, that this is actually middle and not passive? And what would be the significance of it being passive? Why, for example, doesn't he say God prepared them for destruction? Why does he say they were prepared for destruction? Talk to us about that.
Yeah, this is a really important point. So, as you said, formally, it could be construed as either a middle or a passive. But if you actually look, again, I'm appealing to the scholars. You go into guys like James Dunn or Cranfield's commentary on Romans. Neither of them holds to a Calvinist interpretation of this text. Even Ben Witherington, who's a Wesleyan Arminian. And what you'll see is they'll point out that, no, this is definitely a passive. And the reason why they do that, probably the quickest place you could go look is Dan Wallace's Greek grammar, because he's got a section on this. This verb, especially in the perfect tense as it is never used in the New Testament as a middle. And even if it was a middle, the middle doesn't just mean I hit myself, as you said. It can just express the idea of self-interest, right? So you get that in the verb exalexita in Ephesians chapter 1, verse 4. He chose us in him before the foundation of the world. The idea is he chose us for himself, right? So more often the middle voice doesn't even have that reflective sense that is sometimes assumed that it is. And really it's kind of a case of special pleading here, because they want them to have fixed themselves for this destruction. But then you asked a really important question. Why the shift? Why would we have the passive in this line, but in the next line, the active voice with God as the subject? And what the passive can do for us, the reason why we have this here is it does create some asymmetry here. So they're not exactly parallel in every perfect way. In both instances, God is the ultimate agent. That's the point of the analogy. God is the potter. He fixes these vessels. We're still talking about vessels. They're vessels of wrath, which is a genitive of destination. They're on a collision course for wrath, and they're being prepared for destruction, which I know you like that it says that right there. Thinking of your the conditional immortality debates, so the ends there is what's emphatic. But the reason why Paul would use a passive in one case with God as the ultimate agent is to say that there is responsibility here. They do deserve judgment. We all deserve judgment. Paul said all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. There are conditions here being met that make that different from those who God prepares for glory. There are no conditions, Paul has been saying throughout, that warrant why one vessel is going to experience mercy and glory, but there are reasons why there is culpability, there is responsibility in the vessels of wrath prepared for destruction. And so I think that's the reason why you have the change of voice there. And again, there is no I don't know. I believe there's like one scholarly article that was published in the not too distant past that tried to argue that this is the middle voice, but nobody, even Arminian authors, have followed him there. The evidence is very, very strong. And this is what I would say. If I were an Arminian, what I would do is something that the middle participle can do is tell us about a condition. And what it would mean is that these are vessels which are prepared for wrath. And then say, well, it leaves open the question of who the agent of the preparation is, and we have to fill that in by context. Then I would say, well, the context is God as the potter, so he's clearly the agent. They would say, well, they deserved it because they didn't believe. That's better than trying to say that it is grammatically a middle voice. There's really no good scholarly grounds for that.
Yeah. Well, and you make a good point, which is that it would make perfect sense if we were reading Paul rightly that he would use the active voice and explicitly call out God as the agent of preparation for glory in verse 23, because he wants to make absolutely clear that there's no those so prepared ought not to boast in as much. They have no reason for. They're not at all responsible for their being prepared beforehand for glory, whereas those prepared for destruction are responsible and deserving of destruction. Okay, so
real quick, could I make one more point? So, and then if they're looking at your propositional outline, which again I'm not seeing again, we've been having some technical difficulties. That's okay. So you get two markers of purpose that in verse 22, which your viewers can see on the left, and those are both infinitives, right? So God willing to show His wrath and to make known His power, two infinitives of purpose. But then you get another marker of purpose, which is verse 23, where you have a hina clause, and I think that's telling because it places the emphasis there for us. So those initial signs of purpose are ultimately making way for God to show the riches of His glory on vessels of wrath prepared for glory. So the hina clause, in order that He might make known the riches of His glory, that tells us what's ultimate in God's aim here. And so however we present our view holding to unconditional election, I think we need to put the emphasis there where Paul does. God's ultimate aim is to share that glory with these vessels of mercy. So anyways, I think that's just a point of emphasis that we should highlight here.
Very good. Anything else in verses 23 or 24 that you want to cover before we turn to Paul's appeal to Hosea?
Yeah, so getting in verse 24 to the appeal to Hosea, you've got that language of calling again, and it happens in a relative clause, it's in apposition to the vessels of mercy. You could tell because it's also an accusative plural. Those whom he has called are the vessels of wrath, prepared for glory, and that tells us that they're prepared for glory.
Not the vessels of wrath prepared for glory.
I'm sorry. Yeah,
vessels
you're
of
right.
mercy.
Vessels of mercy. Yeah, yeah. Oh, you're right. Yeah. So they're the ones who have been called, and so they are so prepared on the basis of God's calling. And now he's bringing in Jews and Gentiles. So this anticipates some of the things that he's going to say later in chapter 11, where Gentiles are incorporated into the vine and part of this olive tree, I should say. We've got that language of calling again, and that, as you said in verses 25 and 26, he cites two passages from Hosea, which are about God creating out of people who are not his people. And so I think this has double application for Paul. This begins to anticipate what he's going to say in chapter 11, where he believes that God is going to reverse Israel's condition and save all Israel. And I don't universalize that. I think it's as I'll make the point later, it's in terms of a remnant of those who currently do not believe. But he's also talking about the Gentiles. They are not his people, and they have been made his people. They are not his beloved. They're brought into the family. He says they will be called sons of the living God. And so that's from Hosea 2:23 and 1:10, if memory serves. Yeah. So, but it's more language about God's call being creative. God creates his people by his call. God creates vessels of mercy by his call. Again, it's reiterating what we've seen throughout the entire chapter.
One thing I'll add there, and there's too much here to substantiate in any detail in the time we've got, but I'm particularly interested in the way Paul is using Hosea here because of my difference of opinion, probably even with you, about who Israel is in Paul's thinking here. But that's neither here nor there. But because of my interest in Hosea here, I happen to recall that this passage in Hosea that Paul is quoting from, "Those who were not my people, I will call my people." This is actually, at least in Hosea's writing, this is the people who were called not my people are not Gentiles in Hosea's book. It's actually Israel. So faithless Israel are called not my people in Hosea, and God is declaring, "I will call them my people in the very place that I called them not my people." Now we can, in another conversation, we might discuss to what that means as far as the Gentiles are concerned. But the interesting thing is, in that context, it's not, at least as far as I can tell, it's not merely the prediction that faithless Israel will one day become faithful again, and therefore God will call them my people again. Rather, it's because God is intending to once again call them his people that they return to faithfulness. Yeah.
So in the analogy, God is like Hosea, who continues to go after his adulterous wife, and eventually he's going to see to it that he wins them over. And here it's according to his call, right? And so I think it does double duty. I think it refers to, again, Paul saying that in chapter 11 he talks about how they are consigned over to disobedience and they're enemies of the gospel right now, and they're the ones who he is going to have mercy on. So I think it anticipates that, but it also does say that, because he said it very explicitly, not from the Jews only, but also from the Gentiles. They are also not my people, and they're brought in accordance with the call. So I think it does double duty for Paul. I'd love to chat with you about that, because I think I could. I don't even know your view exactly, but if it's different from mine, I bet I could convince you to move over at least a little bit my direction. But maybe we're closer than we realize on that, but we'll have to go down that road sometime.
Yeah, we'll talk about it after my debate. And shameless plug for those of you watching right now, I will be debating Steve Gregg, another fellow professor at Trinity College, on the identity of Israel in the New Covenant context in a week and a half. Oh, wait. now that I think about it, this is going to air. What you and I are discussing right now is going to air after that debate. So, viewers, if you haven't already, go to Trinity Radio YouTube channel and watch the debate between Steve Gregg and I. And after that debate, Robert, then you and I can talk about this more, and you can persuade me. Arguably, you'll be able to persuade me. But anyway, okay, so Paul is here continuing to substantiate that God is the active agent in all of this. It's he who will one day say, "You are my people," to the very people he had previously said, "You are not my people," and it's because of that that they become faithful again. And Paul is appealing to that in verse 26, and then he turns in verse 27 to Isaiah again, and it's here that you think there is a subtle imperfection or deficiency in many English translations, because the Greek connection here is the conjunction de, and the English translation, at least in the ESV, is the word and, but and very often doesn't capture the nuance of de, the Greek conjunction de there. So unpack that for us, and why you think that's important.
Okay. So, Chris, as you said, there are some issues that I have with the translation here. First is that you have the introduction of this new section with de, which is brought over in like the ESV as typical with and. But based on what we see previously, where Paul is citing positively Hosea, he introduces both of those with the word kai, which is normally translated and. Here he introduces it with de, which I think following on those two kais suggests to us that it should be understood as an adversative. So the idea is, even though everything that's come before has happened with Israel, and God's calling has limited the number of ethnic Israelites who are among the true children of Abraham, heirs of the promise, there's something else. There's something more in store. But he says Isaiah is crying out, and that's another place where we have a problem. The ESV has concerning, which would normally be a translation of the Greek preposition peri, but Paul actually wrote huper, and huper means something like on behalf of. So Isaiah is like Paul in the sense that Isaiah is lamenting Israel's condition in his day, just as Paul is lamenting here, and as Moses had done going back to Exodus 32 through 34. Then you get another error in the translation where it begins the quotation as though, indicating a concessive idea, like even though there's this huge number, only it says a remnant will be saved. But in reality, there is no though there. There's actually a conditional marker here on. So the idea would be if the number is so great, and here I think he's talking about the number of the sons of Israel, these unbelieving Israel, not only a remnant will be saved. There is no word corresponding to only in the Greek. That is inferred by the translators, and I think wrongly inferred. What he's saying is that there's this huge number of unbelieving Israelites, like the sands of the sea, but a remnant of them will certainly be saved. And that's anticipating what Paul is going on to say at the end of chapter 11. And part of the basis for this is, if you look at the quotation in verse 28 as it continues, he's got this pair of participles tied together by another kai. So sun telon kai sun temnon, and there that expression, the author who I'm not sure if I've referenced before or not, Paul Heil, Heil, John Paul Heil. Yeah. He shows that if you look at the background here, that this isn't an idiom or an expression that means he will certainly or definitively carry forth what he is determined to do. So this is like almost decretive language. I believe the Christian Standard Bible has something like definitively deciding, right? So this is the idea that God's purpose isn't going to be thwarted for Israel. And again, that's the conclusion that I think we come to in chapter 11. And that's indicated, I think, by this citation from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 1, verse 9, that the Lord of hosts has preserved a remnant. If he had not left us offspring, we would have been like Sodom and become like Gomorrah. We would have been wiped off the face of the earth, completely eradicated. But God, as the prophet Isaiah depicted, he certainly carry out what he is determined to do with Israel. But it's not, again, everything that's come before, it's not based on conditions that we will meet. It's based on the fact that he has definitively decided that he will do so. He has mercy as he has mercy. The text says that he's chapter 11, that he's consigned all, I think that's all Israel, this group that Paul's referring to, over to disobedience in order that he might have mercy on them all. God is going to do something effectual to reverse Israel's fortunes in the future, after the time when this group called the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. So I think this is important, and I hope I expressed it clearly, because my ideas here are derivative of that article. I think he made a really compelling case. It is, like I said, a preview of coming attractions. It tells us that God is certainly going to carry out what he had always determined he would do with Israel, despite her current condition. It doesn't mean that God's plans have failed. The word of God has not fallen, Paul said in verse 6, but it is going to happen exactly as God determines that it will happen. And so I think you get another deterministic theme here with regard to the future mercy of Israel, anticipating what's going to come in chapter 11.
Yeah, very good. Before we wrap things up, though, I want to briefly talk about these last three verses in Romans 9, because I can anticipate, I suspect that Leighton and others would look at these last verses in Romans 9 and suggest that they actually challenge the reading that we have thus far offered, because Paul goes on to ask, what shall we say then? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained it, that is, righteousness that is by faith. So far, so good. But then it says, but that Israel, who pursued a law that would lead to righteousness, did not succeed in reaching that law. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith, but as if it were based on works. They have stumbled over the stumbling stone. So I can imagine why somebody like Leighton would read that and say, it sure sounds like what Paul is saying is that to anticipate the language that we'll read in Romans 11 about being the natural branches being broken off of the tree. It seems as if Paul is saying that the reason that the Jews have been broken off of the tree here in these last verses of Romans 9 is because of what they willed, or more precisely, what they did not will. Namely, they did not will to pursue it by faith. They instead willed to pursue righteousness by works. How would you address that challenge if it were leveled at you? How do these final verses in Romans 9 support, or at least how are they consistent with the reading that we've thus far offered, rather than challenge it?
Yes, so there are a number of things we would say. So 9:30 through close to the end of chapter 10 form a section where Paul reverts back to his discussion of righteousness and faith, which we haven't had up to this point in chapter 9. We've been focused on mercy and calling and election terminology. And so we made the point that there's some incongruity in the assignment of vessels for destruction versus those for glory, right? So that there is culpability there is responsibility there. They did fail to believe, right? But everything we've been seeing, ultimately, God's agency has been emphatic. And what I would say is, if you're going to use this to invalidate everything we've said up to this point, and we've only talked about Greek grammar, I would love to follow up and talk about Second Temple Judaism and dig more deeply into Paul's uses of the Old Testament there, because there's a lot more that's telling that I think makes our case even stronger. But so now he brings up this issue. They have failed to believe, right? So they're absolutely responsible. But again, he's anticipating God overcoming their failure to believe. We just saw there. He's gonna save a remnant. He's gonna have mercy on those who currently do not believe. But flash forward to at the end of chapter 10, verse 19, or verse 18. So he talks about how they need to hear the gospel. Faith comes by hearing, hearing by the word of Christ, and that we, this is partly a call to continuing the mission to the Jewish people, which Paul supports in the book of Romans. But he says in verse 18, I'm going to read from English here since it's on the fly. But I ask, have they not heard? He says, indeed they have, for their voice has gone out into all the earth. So they've already heard, right? And he says, verse 19, but I asked, did Israel understand? First Moses said, I will make you jealous of those who are not a nation. And it's interesting that he says first, protos. Moses, there's something that God had planned to do first before Israel responded to that message of the gospel that they heard. First, Moses says, I will make you jealous of those who are not a nation. With a foolish nation, I will make you angry. And then he says, I have been found by those who did not seek me. Well, what do you mean did not seek me? They did seek him, right? They believed. Israel didn't seek them. No. Paul again is saying no one seeks God. Going back to chapter 3 in the citation. So God has set things up. He's quickly getting back to that. God has set things up to make Israel jealous. Her failure to believe is in accordance with what God had already spoken through Moses. He has shown himself to those who did not ask for him. The gospel has come to the Gentiles, and it's come effectually through God's call and through God's mercy. And yet, in spite of that, even though God is using Israel, provoking her jealousy, creating anger in her, and hardening her in disobedience, God holds out his hand. I have all day long I've held out my hands to a disobedient and contrary people. And I think that's Paul's way of saying Israel's story isn't over. God has saved a remnant now, and he will save a remnant of those effectually who do not believe by extending mercy to them according to his call, as he isn't currently doing, because, again, his purpose, that's what we've seen ultimately through Romans chapter 9, his purpose is to reveal himself to the world, to bring in the full number of the Gentiles. So I get the argument. I think that's the best argument that can be made, is to say, oh, well, according to 9:30 through most of chapter 10, we're going back to righteousness, which is conditioned by faith. They didn't meet that condition. They didn't believe. But that is sandwiched between so much. And I think Paul, when we get to the end of chapter 10, clues us in that their unbelief is even part of God's design to again send the gospel out into the whole world, and to call in a people from among the Gentiles, ultimately to reverse the hardening of a remnant, all Israel, and bring them into the faith effectually. So
Yeah.
that's how I would respond.
Yeah, that's helpful, and it seems to me that what that objection assumes is that this marker, we've been talking about markers. This marker at the beginning of verse 30, teun erumen, what therefore shall we say?
Yes.
It assumes that is a marker, an indication that Paul is summarizing what he has just said throughout Romans 9, but in which case the objection might be more weighty than you and I would say it is. But this seems to me to be more transitionary into the next things that Paul wants to talk about. So he's not saying, based on everything that I've just said, therefore we conclude that Israel failed to pursue righteousness by faith. Rather, he's transitioning into a discussion of righteousness by faith, and as such, these verses don't inform what Paul has just been concluding from his, or inferring from his appeals to Old Testament text. Does that seem about right?
Yeah, I agree. And I think that we want to emphasize their responsibility as well. So there's no question about that. They have failed to believe, but Paul tells us time and time again that throughout this text that even that is ultimately explainable through divine agency. So I get the temptation to want to apologize for that. I don't mean that pejoratively, but to kind of find different ways that don't seem arbitrary, that don't raise those questions that the objector raised in chapter 9. But I think those were raised because as Paul concludes chapter 11, that there is mystery to this. It's stunning the way God has done this, and who can understand it? Who can plumb its depths and counsel God? Nobody. What do? We worship Him.
Yeah.
We worship Him. So I think that's the point.
Okay, very good. Well, as a way to start to wrap things up, we've got into the nitty gritty details. We've gone into the weeds. Let's zoom out again and just summarize for us based on everything we've said thus far. In a nutshell, just to what extent does Romans 9 support the Calvinist doctrine of unconditional election? What do you think we can confidently say about that?
So in wrapping things up, I would go back to the inferences that we've been highlighting throughout, and you get those again, in especially emphatically in verses 16 and 18, where Paul is really summarizing major points that he's drawing out of these texts. And in verse 16, again, he says that it is not according to the one who wills or the one who works, but on the God who has mercy. And that he's drawn out, having already undermined systems of worth that humans established, such as primogeniture in the case of God choosing a younger son instead of the firstborn, and even more strongly in the case of God choosing Jacob rather than Esau, equals who are born of the same act of conception. The human will is not a condition either. It's not according to worth, it's not according to works, and according to verse 16, it is not according to the one who wills. It's according to the one who has mercy, the God who has mercy. And that's the point that Paul makes even more emphatically again in verse 18. God has mercy on whom he wants, and he hardens whom he wants. Every time we see positively this language of the will, it's the divine will. His will can't be resisted. His will mercies and hardens as he sees fit. And I think when we put the focus there, we're seeing what Paul's point was, and all that he had to say. God's purpose according to election is not maintained by any act of the human will. It's not maintained, of course, by works, as Paul said so emphatically throughout Romans, and it's not because they are more worthy. Paul really undermines that in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 with his discussion of election and calling there, God choosing the nots in order to confound those who have. So all that to say, when we get here and we talk about God's calling and God's mercy, it's free in every sense of the word. It's uncoerced. It's unconditioned. Nobody can make a claim on it. But Paul has in that a great cause for worship, and he thinks in the case of Israel, God is not yet done with them, and there's more to look forward to in God's mercy in that regard. But all that gives us some really strong ammunition for building up a doctrine of unconditional election.
Very good. So I want to ask you for some resources here. Firstly, what would you recommend for viewers who want to have the best resource available to them for a treatment of Romans 9 from our perspective? Where would you recommend that people turn?
So if you have some competence in Greek, John Piper's monograph, The Justification of God, I think is still the standard from that perspective, but it is very technical. I really think if you haven't done a year of Greek, you're going to have a hard time working through some parts of it. But he's very careful. He's very thorough. It's very helpful. You don't have to agree with absolutely every argument that he makes, but you're going to want to, because he leaves no stone unturned. I would say something a little more neutral but conducive to our view is the book by John Barclay that I just mentioned. He's got a big, thick book. I think I have it right here. Okay, yeah, this one, Paul and the Gift, and it's made huge waves among scholars on Paul. It's regarded probably as, in my opinion, the best book ever written on Paul's theology of grace, and he's got a really great section on Romans 9 to 11. He doesn't go as far as you and I would want him to go, but he says a lot there that makes a strong case, moving towards the way that we're reading the text. Other than that, there's some great commentaries. less technical. I just recently came across David Peterson's little commentary on Romans, and his treatment on 9 is really great because he's very to the point, and he draws out the good stuff. But there's always Doug Moo's big thick commentary. I've got them both here, and if you compare the two, they're very different. But those are the places that I would go, and I really like the balance though of Piper and Barclay, because I think sometimes, as I said at the beginning, we're a little guilty of reading too much of our system into Romans 9, and I think that balance will help you have a little bit of integrity and not building too much of your case on the foundation of Romans 9. It helps, but it doesn't get us all the way there. And hopefully this will be helpful for people who don't have background in Greek. That's what Chris and I we talked about wanting to do, was make this accessible. So hopefully we succeeded in that, to try to not get too technical, but it's important stuff. So
yeah, very good. And then lastly, in terms of resources, let's move out of Romans 9 and even out of Paul specifically to Scripture as a whole. If you wanted to point viewers to the best resource defending unconditional election from all of Scripture, is there a particular resource or author that you would recommend?
I still like that collection of essays, Still Sovereign. I think that's pretty helpful. Are you familiar with that one?
I'm not.
I think it's edited by Thomas Schreiner and Bruce Ware.
That's right.
And they it's a collection of essays that it's got a really good one on the question of what it means to foreknow, for instance, that I can remember off the top of my head. Not all essays in a collection of essays are created equally, so that's not a plug for every one of them, but I still think that's probably the best resource. I'm looking over here at my bookshelf to see if there's something else that I would recommend in that way, but that's probably where I would go. I don't know anything else that brings that together. The essay on the Gospel of John is really good in that one as well. So that'd be a good place to look.
Awesome. Well, I've really appreciated all the time that you've spent with me today. I know you've put a lot of work into preparing for this, and I do definitely want to have you on again in the future to follow up on Paul's use of the Old Testament and the intertestamental literature and stuff like that. But I think this has been a great introduction for my audience into unconditional election, especially as a follow-up to my last episode where I discussed whether it's arbitrary, and I look forward to talking to you more about it in the future. Thanks again for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. It's a lot of fun, and I hope it proves helpful. So
I think it will.
Good.
All right. Well, I hope that you enjoyed that interview. I enjoyed interacting with you guys in the chat while it was ongoing, and I know it was a bit of a long interview, but we dove deeply into the Greek, and we wanted to make it a resource to which people could return when they are exploring this topic on their own. And so I think we accomplished that well. Let me tell you a little bit about what's going to come up in future episodes of Theopologetics. Firstly, yes, Jamie, this now is live. I'm actually talking to you right now. So 2 weeks from today will be October 5th, Monday, October 5th, and at 6 p.m. on Monday, October 5th, on the next episode of Theopologetics, we'll be looking at the statement that Jesus makes in Matthew 24:34. I think it's Matthew 24:34, in which he says, "This generation shall not pass away before all these things take place." I'll be introducing you, my audience, to the topic of preterism. And for those of you who might be afraid of that word, no, I'm not talking about hyperpreterism or so-called full preterism. I'm talking about orthodox preterism, historic preterism, preterism full stop, as it should be. I'm sorry, Shannon, I can't give you one every week because every other week I'm doing Rethinking Hell Live. So, tune into Rethinking Hell Live on alternating Mondays, and you'll still get excellent content, just on a much more narrow topic. Anyway, so 2 weeks from today, again, October 5th, Monday, 6 p.m., tune in for a treatment of "This generation shall not pass away before all these things take place" in Matthew 24:34 for an introduction to preterism. And then 2 weeks after that, which will be October 19th will be an entirely pre-recorded episode because my wife and I and our family will be returning that very day from a week and a half or 2 week long trip out of town, and I won't be here in time to do Theopologetics live, but I will have an episode recorded in advance, and I'm really excited about it, and I think it's going to be a real meaty, deep, challenging episode, because what I'm going to be doing is having my friend Isaiah Burridge on, whom I mentioned in the introduction to this episode of the show. He's going to be joining me, as will his wife Megan, because he is somebody who's fighting cancer and has had a heart transplant early on in his life, and at times it has been seeming as if it may be terminal. Thank God right now it doesn't appear that way. But he and his wife are going to be joining us to discuss the relationship between this kind of real extreme suffering and trial, the relationship of that to the sovereignty of God, the Calvinism, non-Calvinism debate, and to theodicy. So we'll be discussing such issues as how do we reconcile the reality of natural evils like cancer with the truth of God's goodness, and how do we what is the best theodicy to explain that, and does Calvinism make the issue of things like cancer worse or better, more tolerable? So I think that's going to be really interesting as well, and I hope you'll tune in. And hopefully between now and then, I will publish the first installment of a separate series of videos that I'm intending to call Theopologetics Extra. These will be much shorter, entirely pre-recorded episodes of the show on very specific topics. And I think that what I'd like to do before I go on vacation is publish the first episode of Theopologetics Extra. And we'll be looking at Romans 8, 28 or 29, whichever one it is in which Paul says, those whom God foreknew, the verb is prognosko. And my friend and fellow professor at Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary thinks that word prognosko there, normally translated foreknew, actually means knew formerly. Like it's a reference to Israelites of the past that God knew back then, before now. And I'm going to be putting that reading to the test. So there's a lot of interesting content coming up, I think, in upcoming weeks for Theopologetics. But don't forget, as I announced at the beginning of the show, that this coming Friday, 4 a.m. Pacific, 7 a.m. Eastern, I'll be delivering a lecture on the topic of hell for South African Theological Seminary. And just Google that or rewind back to the beginning of the show to get that link. And do consider signing up for the Rethinking Hell conference, which is coming up in just about a month and a half. I think it's going to be really great stuff. RethinkingHellConference.com. But anyway, again, I'll just leave you with this. Please do come back 2 weeks from today, Monday, October 5th at 6 p.m. Pacific, where we'll dig into the fun topic of eschatology, namely the debate between premillennialists on the one hand and preterists like me on the other hand. As we tackle the subject, we tackle the topic. We try to figure out what Jesus meant when he said, "This generation shall not pass before all these things take place." So until then, take care, and thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Theopologetics. Bye-bye. I've been your host, Chris Date, and thanks so much for watching Theopologetics, where we think together through what we believe, why we believe it, and not something else. If you've enjoyed this episode, please click the thumbs up, like icon, the subscribe button, and the bell icon to receive notifications when new videos are streamed or uploaded. Either way, come back in 2 weeks for the next episode of Theopologetics, streaming live on YouTube every other Monday at 6 p.m. Pacific. Until then...